This week on Africa Weekly, we take you to Malawi, where rumours of blood-sucking vampires have led to a rampage. We head to South Africa, where gang violence is on the rise. And we go to St. Helena, where the uncovered remains of former slaves are being prepared for reburial. But first, a summary of the stories that made the headlines this week. Celebrations on the streets of Harare as President Robert Mugabe finally announced that he was stepping down after 37 years in power. The protracted resignation of the world's oldest serving head of state came after a week of confusion following a sudden military takeover, which the army claimed was not a coup. After he was placed under house arrest and following a series of mass street protests, his shock announcement letter was read out in Parliament, where MPs had convened to impeach 93-year-old Mugabe.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, in terms of Section 96, subsection 1 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, hereby formally tender my resignation as the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe with immediate effect.
Being sworn in as the new leader of Zimbabwe is Emmerson Mnangagwa, who returned to the country this week. The 75-year-old was a former ally of Mugabe, who sacked him just 2 weeks ago, prompting Mnangagwa to flee the country. A bitter dispute between him and the former First Lady, both of whom were vying for the top position, is seen to have triggered the military intervention and Mugabe's ultimate downfall. News of Mugabe's departure has been hailed by world leaders as a historic opportunity to appoint a new leader through free and fair elections, but Mnangagwa, nicknamed the Crocodile for his ruthlessness, is a hardliner with ties to the military who could prove as authoritarian as his predecessor. An unprecedented militant attack on a mosque in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula has left over 200 people killed. Officials said militants bombed, then opened fire on worshippers attending weekly prayers in the mosque in the Restif Peninsula, where authorities are battling the Islamic State group. A South African appeals court has more than doubled Paralympic champion Oscar Pistorius' sentence for murdering his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp. After prosecutors argued earlier this month that Pistorius failed to show general remorse and the state appealed that his original sentence of 6 years was too lenient, Pistorius was then handed down 13 years and 5 months in jail for the murder. The Paralympic athlete shot dead Steenkamp in the early hours of Valentine's Day in 2013. When he fired 4 times through the door of his bedroom toilet, but he says he mistook her for a burglar. Protesters took to the streets in Kenyan opposition strongholds this week after the Supreme Court unanimously validated President Uhuru Kenyatta's victory in the country's October 26 presidential election. Meanwhile, in ruling party strongholds, Kenyatta supporters celebrated the court's decision. At least 30 people were killed after farmers attacked herdsmen in northeast Nigeria's Adamawa state, in the latest in a long-running series of similar clashes across the country. Reports of Monday's attack came a day after at least 50 worshippers were killed in a suicide bombing in a mosque in Mubi, also in Adamawa state. Although no group has claimed responsibility, the bombing bore the hallmarks of Boko Haram Islamists who are waging a jihadist uprising in Nigeria's northeast.
Florence Kalunga says she's had her blood sucked out by a vampire. She's not the only one who's recently made the shocking claim in Nolongoliwa in South Malawi. Rumours of vampire-like acts in rural parts of the country have led to panic, spreading through this village where many still believe in witchcraft.
I collapsed and my family took me outside the house, but I still felt weak, so I asked my brothers to sound the alarm. I realised that the tip of my finger had been pricked and my arm had become numb, as if I'd been sedated.
Some locals have been taking matters into their own hands. At least 7 people were killed by vigilantes in a nearby district on suspicion of being real-life vampires. Farmer Orlando Chaponda was recently accused of conniving with bloodsuckers, and nearly 2,000 villagers carrying machetes stormed his home.
They were with panga knives and bricks, trying to call my name. Where is your husband? Where is he? We want him. We want the bloodsuckers.
A lack of education is fueling fear in rural areas where poverty is widespread. And now this fear is affecting the number of blood donations.
It has reduced collaboration, tremendous collaboration that we've been receiving in the past from the gatekeepers to these communities, from the head teachers, the principals, the village headmen and the traditional leaders who have always welcomed us when we wanted to visit their communities to collect blood.
Tourism has also suffered with a decline in the number of visitors following the recent spate of attacks. With over 200 vigilantes arrested so far, the government hopes to finally put an end to the rumours and put the real criminals behind bars.
A young man has been shot dead in this township in Cape Town, another victim in battles between rival gangs. As usual, police rush to the scene, and bystanders are left struggling to cope with the constant stress caused by gang violence.
I immediately get up from my bed and get under my bed, because that's how freaked out I am.
I think for many of us, we don't know what peace is. We don't know what harmony is. We've grown up with violence all our lives.
The township has one of the highest gang-related murder rates in South Africa. Locals fear for their lives when walking the streets, with more than 50 people caught in the crossfire in the past 4 months. High unemployment and widespread social problems lead many residents to find work with the gangs.
There's a lot of what seems to be cooperation between the community and the gangs, not because people want to, but because people's circumstances force them to cooperate with the gangs for their own survival.
The lucrative drug trade and other criminal activities mean that gangs have mushroomed and become more heavily armed. Police battle to suppress turf wars and reprisal attacks. So much so that the provincial government is considering calling for the deployment of the army.
If soldiers are brought in not as soldiers, but in terms of Section 30 of the Defence Act, as force multipliers for the police, that will give us the numbers and the visibility that we require. And that makes an enormous difference.
Soldiers were previously deployed to these townships in 2015. But 2 years later, gang membership in the area has soared, and some believe that the only long-term solution would be major social and economic change.
Today, it's an industrial area, but this valley in St. Helena is where the remote island's painful history has been brought back into the present. It was here in 2008 that the remains of hundreds of former slaves were unearthed during work to build a road for the island's new airport.
Still can see some of the small excavating works here where some of the graves used to be.
In the 19th century, the Royal Navy brought thousands of freed slaves here after the trade had been abolished in the British Empire but continued elsewhere. Rescued from the ships of traffickers, they had been kept in appalling conditions, and many died on arrival in St. Helena. For almost 10 years since their rediscovery, the remains have been kept in this storeroom next to Jamestown Prison. A small note on the door is the only thing that gives a clue as to what's inside. Each week, local resident Anina comes to pray in front of the locked door. She's fighting to make sure the freed slaves get a proper burial.
In light of the airport development, we found these remains and we uncovered a part of history that we thought we could forget about, and we have forced people to remember it. But this uncovering and 10 years of storage is because it's never been a priority. The airport has been the priority for a very long time.
The remains are the responsibility of the airport management. They insist they're doing everything possible to preserve them properly.
It's an old stone building. It's got very thick stone walls, which again help with the climate control naturally, rather than having to put in expensive air conditioning units.
After nearly a decade, the island authorities have appointed a small group of experts to look into reburying the remains, with many hoping the former slaves will finally be laid to rest with dignity.
And in sport, Rwanda's Joseph Areruya won the 2017 edition of the Tour of Rwanda in Kigali on Sunday, earning the country its 4th yellow jersey in a row. Next week, we take you to the Moroccan hillside town of Chefchaouen as it undergoes a green transformation. That's all from us at Africa Weekly. Until next week.